Good afternoon. I'm Agneta. I'm the Director of the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication. Welcome to our first lecture in the semester in spring 2023. We hold a series of lectures this semester as well as a series of workshops on how to write effectively. And those workshops are for everybody, but particularly for international students. So I want you to be aware of the resources that are available on campus, right? So without further ado, I'm going to give the time to my colleague, Professor Joy Jensen, to introduce our speaker today.
Great. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for coming. I think this will be a fabulous talk, and more fabulous because you're here to listen. So I am here to introduce Dr. Gail Prasad, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at York University in Canada. Her research focuses on critical multilingual language awareness and approaches to multilingual education and teacher development. She has partnered in research with teachers, students, and families in Canada, the US, France, Kenya, and Burkina Faso. Her scholarship has been published in English and French in journals including TESOL Quarterly, the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, the Canadian Modern Language Review, and Waterpole. She's also a co-editor of a book that is in front of Dr. Hood, Multilingualism in Education, Researchers' Pathways and Perspectives, published by Cambridge University Press. So we are so fortunate to have her. Thank you so much for coming.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation to be here with you, and to the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication for hosting. It's really a delight to be with you. I think we have an hour? Okay.
We actually have an hour and a half, but
okay.
Some of that could be for questions, so
okay.
Take your time.
You might be, yes, I'll try and stay in the hour and then open it up for some sharing of experience. And I'm going to just start by saying I've entitled this Brown Blanche Black period, weaving intersections of language, culture, race through evocative autoethnography. And as Joy mentioned, my work has been focused on multilingual education and really not just the learning of English if I'm teaching in an English setting, or the learning of French, as we have Francophone schools in Canada as well, but how we live together in classrooms that are multilingual. So we have speakers of multiple languages who often come into spaces where there's one language of instruction, maybe two. I was working in dual language immersion contexts when I was in the US, or in other bilingual settings in France. But there is largely there are languages of instruction, and then there are all of the people in the room, whether that be the teacher or the students, that bring their repertoires with them. And today I'm going to share a little bit about my sense-making process as someone coming into applied linguistics, and weaving together the various parts of my identity as I do this work. So we're going to talk about seeing multilingualisms, and I put it in the plural form because I think that the ways in which it manifests are different and not homogeneous, and the S helps us see that heterogeneity. And then I want to talk about weaving as a metaphor as well as a practice for humanizing multilingual research. And I'm using the approach of evocative autoethnography to share some moments of dissonance, attention, and awareness. And then I will tie this to the work that I've been doing over the last decade, trying to understand children's and youth social representations of linguistic diversity through teaching and learning together in multilingual classrooms. And a word on social representations are in common language, the images that we form of languages, language speakers, and language practices. And the work of the social representation of languages really started, and I encountered it in French language scholarship, but really helped me understand that we all form these social categories that help us make sense of our worlds, and they are neither right nor wrong. They simply are how we make sense of our experience, and there is the capacity to transform them, and that's why I'm hopeful today. So, starting out with multilingualisms, defining multilingualisms is important. Because it affects how we see who is multilingual. And we have seen a veritable explosion of terminology that has tried to explain or capture the languaging practices of multilinguals in recent years. And you can see from all of them, I won't read them all, in part because it's a word soup and they're sometimes hard to pronounce. But really what this shows us is that there is a shift away from a traditional view of multilingualism as multiple separate monolingualisms that you count as multilingual when you can speak with a native-like proficiency across more than one. And the multilingual turn in English language scholarship began to help us recognize that this view of multilingualism doesn't align with the lived experience of multilinguals. And in Francophone scholarship, the term plurilinguisme emerged and has been quite powerful and was taken up by the Council of Europe to describe an individual's interrelated network of languages and cultural practices. And in this vision of multilingualism, languages are seen as dynamic, overlapping, that we have a varied capacity in them according to how we use them. And so many people have said we are all plurilingual. Enrique Picardo has said monolinguals don't exist, only unaware plurilinguals do. And I think that that's a powerful statement. It's also one that is very hard for people who identify as being monolinguals to say, oh, but I'm not actually proficient, or I don't actually count in these other languages. And so what I've been trying to wrestle with is, what do we do to help transform that idea that we all have the capacity to expand our communicative repertoire, and that we do so over time, space, and use. And I'll just draw attention here that the history of plurilinguisme in French is been here for some time. In fact, there was a journal that first started in the 1990s called Plurilinguisme that Danielle Moore talks about in her work. And there's a publication here that was dated in 1997. An English language publication, we generally refer to the multilingual turn in about 2014, which was right when I was finishing my PhD, and you could see this explosion of terms that was all trying to capture these different practices. And so I just draw attention to it because I think it's important to continue to foreground the fact that knowledge is made and contributed across a variety of languages, and that this difference, this epistemic diversity is important. And preserving languages and preserving ways of being and knowing in the academy is equally vital to our contribution and making of knowledge. So in studying multilingualism, Blomark, Collins, and Slemberg have described that we need to both attend to the macro conditions and the micro individual. So they describe macro contexts as institutional, and the micro at the individual level. And so here I've represented it by this individual being this circle that comes in with what they've described as truncated multilingualism, or an individual communicative repertoire. And they move through various spaces like schools and libraries and homes and society. And as they move through these spaces, their communicative repertoire is either recognized, affirmed, valued, or not. And this process of weaving between these spaces is one that they have to make sense of. And as researchers, I've been focused on the individual processes by which people encounter institutions and how they weave their repertoires. So talking about the notion of repertoire has been around for a very long time. Betsy Rhymes, in her work, talks about expanding communicative repertoires, including not just language, but other modes of communication. Lee Way's talked about overcoming our lingua bias and thinking about the ways in which multimodality plays in. And we've seen in the multilingual turn a real embracing of this idea that we are developing this expansive repertoire of practice. I've also come to the practice of weaving as a research methodology because for me it has helped me understand how the intersections of languages and cultures and race can actually help build something more complex and more whole. So the piece that you see up here is a paper collage, a mixed media collage that I created for the British Association of Applied Linguistics when they had a call in 2019 for visualizing multilingualism. And I describe it as saying that to overcome what Lee describes as a lingua bias requires a shift from studying named languages only as discrete structures to co-investigating with social actors who draw on their expansive communicative repertoires differentially across contexts. Interweaving repertoires, this collage, began as a tapestry of burlap and lace woven together with different variegated yarns, threads, and twine. Mixed media tapestry as a form reflects how repertoires expand through the addition of new materials. And as different fibers are incorporated through various stitching and weaving practices, the tapestry takes on new textures and depth. For this piece, the resulting tapestry was then scanned and created into a digital print. And the print was cut into unequal strips and staggered to reflect differences across individuals' communicative repertoires. Subsequently, print materials were gathered across a variety of spaces. These found papers were then cut into uneven strips and woven into the printed tapestry, the print, to reflect how linguistic landscapes of our lives become interwoven with our repertoires. At first glance, interweaving repertoires looks like a mosaic, made up of contrasting and separate squares that never come together or do more than touch. The weaving process, however, does much more than simply bringing individuals and their repertoires into contact. Interweaving mutually reinforces a stronger, richer, and more complex whole. Ultimately, interweaving repertoire seeks to highlight that linguistic diversity is a resource that transforms both individuals and communities. And so recognizing the interface between studying multilingualism at the individual level and at the macro level. In the book that was just shared, Multilingualism in Education, our effort with Nathalie Auger and Emmanuel Le Pichon, the other co-editors, was to highlight the person behind the paper. And many academics have the experience of going to a conference and meeting someone that they've read and realizing, oh, they are actually embodied. And for me as an editor, it was insightful to hear the stories of individuals. And I've often thought as a graduate student what the experience, about who it is that I'm reading. How did they come to what they are talking about? And how is it that we fly around the world and listen to people read papers without ever getting to know who they are as individuals? So today I'm going to share through evocative autoethnography more of who I am. You'll hear how my experiences intersect with the work that I do. But the intent is to promote an embodied dialogue. So another piece of the process of editing the book was that many people that we approached to both write chapters and who refused, or people who did contribute, and there are 33 scholars who participated, talked about the difficulty they had in sharing the personal narrative. It's not a conventional form that we use in academia. even though as applied linguists and as social language researchers, we often ask other people to share their stories and their language biographies. And so in my work, I have been working to incorporate the arts as a way of helping people visualize their language biographies and then narrate them. And Brigitte Busch was at the helm of developing a tool called the language portrait, and she describes that processes that influence language use tend to operate unconsciously and cannot be easily verbalized. The switch in mode of representation from the word to the image helps to deconstruct internalized categories, to reflect upon embodied practices, and to generate narratives that are less bound to genre expectations. While the logic of the word is characterized by a time-bound linear sequence, visual representation is characterized by space and simultaneity and requires attention to the ways in which the various components of a picture relate to each other. So I think we begin to hear some of these stories, the embodied experience of language in the narratives that authors have shared. But in my experience, after the book came out in the spring, I was asked to reflect upon what I found most impactful from the published volume. And without hesitation, I shared how reading the language biographies and research pathways of other racialized scholars like myself was particularly heartening, as I appreciated their vulnerability and authenticity. Simply put, I didn't feel as alone in the academy anymore. And I felt seen, and I had the courage to keep leaning into the work I was doing with largely racialized populations. My reflection was countered at the end with a comment that it's become quite trendy to talk about being racialized, and that it's still quite contrived, or a contrived sort of vulnerability to talk about our stories in an academic publication. And as the weight of those words hit me, I really felt the floor drop out beneath me. And I could feel myself floating outside of my body, looking down at the situation and wondering, how was the legitimacy of my experience in my racialized body being questioned once again? So it gave me pause, and I felt paralyzed, and I didn't know how to come back to my story or to my body, in a sense. And so I came to the work of autoethnography through Ellison and Bachner's work, where they describe evocative autoethnography, or the work of it is to extend ethnography to include the heart, and to include the heart, the autobiographical, and the artistic text. And they talk about how autoethnography is written from an insider perspective as a member of a community. And for me, that evokes a number of questions, because I am multiracial, multilingual, multicultural, and so I wonder a lot about where I belong. To what category do I fit? And then I was reading Sarah Crowley's work, where she writes that one writes autoethnography from reflections that one has already had or has already experienced from a life that one cannot step outside. Autoethnography cannot claim to resolve a theoretical issue, as if to speak for essentialized masses. In its best uses, it can shine a light on the relations of ruling and connect members' voices to theory. And Carl Lego adds to the saying that by sharing our stories, we reveal ourselves in intimate ways, and we grow more confident in our conviction about the power of words for writing our lived stories and transforming our living stories and creating possibilities for more enhancing life stories. So because I was stuck and a little bit trepidatious about returning to writing, I went back into artistic practice. And the practice of weaving is made up by interlacing warp and weft threads. The vertical warp forms the structure of the textile that is held on the loom. So those are the vertical strings that you see right now. And the weft is what intersects the warp as it's drawn across the loom and over and under the warp. And in her dissertation, Wefting the Warp, Paulus notes that on a loom or in a hierarchical system like the academy, the warp is the standard. The weft, on the other hand, is the other. It is non-normative and inferior to the warp, and it relies on the warp for its structure and movement. The weft thread of my life and work has been the pursuit of interwoven belonging among my diverse experiences and cultivating conditions to allow others to experience the same in educational settings and beyond. I've sought to navigate warped institutional policies and practices that have and continue to make it difficult for minoritized others to weave intersectional identities of belonging within the academy. Polis's weaving explores how wefting the warp, and by extension centering the other, reinforces the value and strength of each, and stresses the importance both weft and warp to move together, simultaneously building structure and moving within the structure to create a woven form that reinforces the importance of difference beyond the idealized normative and non-normative dichotomy. So in preparing for this talk and for writing autoethnographic narratives from 4 critical experiences in my journey of becoming an applied linguist, I began first by physically weaving textural threads and silk sari yarns to give me space to quell the cacophony of questions and doubts in my mind and to connect through my hands and my heart and my body back to my lived experience. For each weaving that I'm going to share, I selected different ribbons and yarns made from remnants of silk saris by cutting them into thin strips and sewing them together to make skeins that I used to warp the loom. Then I printed published research articles and identity texts from each research context and gathered found texts in languages used in each experience. I cut them by design into strips of various widths to serve as the weft. Choosing materials for weaving helped me sense my way back into the elements of story that were most salient for me. And as I set to work weaving the strands and texts through the silk sari warp of my loom, I sensed my way forward. In each of the 4 weavings, I felt the warp and the weft intersect with one another and gradually hold together as whole. While the process and product were both necessary and revealing for me, you're going to see the final product while listening to textile weaving made of textiles, texts, and to give you a woven account. Okay, the lessons that are shown evocatively through each textile are shown rather than told in the form of a traditional research text. So, here's the first one. I put the title of it right in large so you can see them, and you can indulge me in reading. Brown, dash. People have a terrible time trying to place me, even when I'm standing right in front of them. Even when I explain that I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, they persist in asking me what my background is and where I'm really from. This exchange has unfolded for as long as I can remember, and as long as I've been able to speak for myself because I'm brown, dash. I use the M dash rather than a hyphen, meant as an artistic punctuation mark to evoke pause. I've always resisted hyphens, as they feel subtractive to me, like a minus sign. I'm brown, dash. Multiracial, multicultural, and multilingual. And I was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, by my father, Chandrashwar Prasad, who had immigrated from Patna, India, and my mother, Marty Toyoko Prasad, who had immigrated, Marty Toyoko Yasunaka, who was a second-generation Japanese Canadian. The hyphen in Japanese Canadian has always been important to my mother because she identifies as Japanese hyphen Canadian rather than wholly Japanese, because she lost her Japanese language along with her family's home and their possessions as a result of the Japanese internment in Canada during World War II and the pressure to assimilate after the war. My mother's family never talked about the internment when I was a child, so my early connection to my Japanese heritage was largely from associations I made with family celebrations, cultural events, and practices with other Japanese Canadians. Despite growing up and wanting to learn Hindi to be able to talk with my family in India, the advice of the school system to multilingual immigrant parents at the time was to speak to their children exclusively in English if they wanted them to succeed academically. For my parents, like so many other immigrant families, education was a path to security and success, both for us as children and for themselves as parents. From childhood, I came to understand language intuitively to be a defining marker of difference, and I developed a heightened sensitivity to the linguistic borders and boundaries that determined whether or not and to whom you belonged. My early exposure to and curiosity about different languages and literacies grew into more critical questions about how languages and languaging practices function as powerful categories of difference. As I moved through my education and became acutely aware through my embodied experience of the intersections of language and race. As a child, I didn't have the language or the permission to talk about my experiences of discrimination and exclusion on the basis of language or race, because I was raised to be grateful for the privilege of living in Canada, where we were part of Canada's multicultural mosaic. And I had more access to education and opportunity than my parents ever had or ever would. All the while, the theory of ratiolinguistics was settling into my body. So I moved on, and while I was working as an elementary English teacher in a French international school, I decided to pursue a master's in second language education and comparative and international development, to explore more deeply questions that had begun to emerge in my practice with multilingual children. I was growing perplexed and uneasy as I watched my young students in this international elite school, who were from much more affluent backgrounds than I was from, learn to read and write and speak and play in French and English in class, as well as Mandarin and Spanish through extracurricular offerings at the school, all while continuing to develop their home languages and literacies. I wondered, what is the difference between my immigrant parents' multilingualisms and the multilingualisms of students in my classes and their parents? That our language practices and proficiencies, or lack thereof, are treated so differently. So during my master's, I had the opportunity to complete a language and literacy research practicum with a non-governmental organization in Burkina Faso. My previous international experiences in Egypt and Lebanon, Jordan and Kenya had always been in English, but this field experience was going to be in French, with an AIDS orphanage and school where children came from 10 different regional communities with different languages spoken in addition to Moray, one of the national languages of Burkina Faso. As a result of colonization by the French, and according to national policy, K-12 education was conducted in French. Although my linguistic insecurity in French was quite high, I was reassured by the Canadian team that a Canadian team of nurses would be on site for my arrival. The Canadian nurses were there to provide vaccinations for the children before they began classes, and I would be working with school administrators and teachers and children to perform a program evaluation on biliteracy development as they were introducing English in school. I quickly became known in the village as La Blanche, the white woman. And given that I had spent my entire life being brown, I found the name La Blanche to be quite unsettling and uncomfortable. One afternoon, following a classroom observation when students had referred to me again as La Blanche, I asked the teacher why I'd been given that name, especially because I was not white. In a matter-of-fact way, he explained that I was part of the Canadian team and I spoke English. And I wondered, because my entire time there I was speaking French. But it had nothing to do with my skin, he assured me. They meant it with affection, because they were quite thankful that I actually spoke French and spent so much time talking with them and listening to them, unlike most of the foreigners who came to visit and only spoke English. In this instance, my proximity to English made me white. I struggled to wrap my head around how being called a white woman in French by Burkinabe locals could be a term of endearment. I felt like my brownness was being erased by virtue of association with an otherwise all-white team of Canadian Anglophone nurses. This early experience of international fieldwork raised my awareness to my positionality as a foreign researcher in the field as a complex entanglement of linguistic privilege, nationality, and racialization. I had not come prepared to engage such reflexive questions about my own identities. While I had entered the field feeling rather green, partially because I was nauseous from a long flight and turbulent flight, I became aware of how my linguistic privilege and nationality had in a sense turned me white. This erasure was not a case of passing as white, but rather of being ascribed an identity that I carried very hauntingly. Whereas I had been consumed with my overwhelming sense of linguistic insecurity prior to and throughout my fieldwork due to my self-assessed limited French competence, my proficiency or lack thereof was completely overshadowed by the privilege of my Canadian nationality and the pervasive ideology of whiteness, the whiteness of English. Then, during my PhD, I was awarded a Weston Doctoral Fellowship, which allowed for me, from the University of Toronto, that allowed me to spend a year at the Université Paul Valéry, Montpellier 3, in France, to continue my training with Dr. Nathalie Auger, who I co-edited the book with. And this opportunity allowed me to do field work in French schools to study children's social representations of plurilingualism. I embraced the opportunity to be immersed in French and to learn more about the conceptualization of plurilingualism in French scholarship, as well as its practice in French schools. My linguistic insecurity in French remained high, although I was more confident than I'd been in Burkina Faso. And during my year in France, my brown skin and my very heavy Anglophone accent raised different questions for me and my interlocutors. When I was asked where I was from, I always explained that I was from Canada. And my response was typically met with some protestation. Mais non, vous avez pas l'accent canadien, plutôt américain? I was not American. I would go on to explain that I wasn't American and I wasn't French Canadian, but rather I was Anglophone from Toronto. I was Anglophone from Toronto? Well, this clarification would often be followed by an encouraging reply that I had learned French very well for an Anglophone. It would then be followed by one further question asking where I was from originally. That is, what were my family's origins, and did I speak the languages associated with my cultural heritage? Although I'd grown accustomed to questions of my cultural heritage while I was in Canada, I experienced a new form of unease being misidentified as American by virtue of my Anglophone accent when doing my very best to get by in French. As I observed in school classrooms and worked at the university, I tried to make myself at home in my rented flat off de la Place de la Comédie in the old city center of Montpellier. I wrestled with how I felt at times that my skin and my accent betrayed me, and at other times it lent me a complex sense of legitimacy as a researcher. Students and teachers often expressed surprise to discover that I was a brown Anglophone Canadian who had learned accented, but not my own languages. Admittedly, this reaction provoked a persistent sense of linguistic inadequacy, not simply as a researcher, but as an individual from a multiracial and multicultural background. I didn't look like a white Anglophone, but I also couldn't speak other brown languages. Their surprise, however, was gradually tempered with some understanding when they learned that my research focused on linguistic diversity in multilingual schools. It seemed to make sense to them at some level that I was an immigrant studying multilingual immigrant students in French schools. I gained legitimacy as a researcher because I was investigating the experiences of children like myself, only now in a French context. I was becoming aware that becoming a racialized applied linguist carried with it an expectation that my social research must concern the experience of racialized communities. Just as I had wondered in the early days in the classroom why my affluent students' multilingualisms were being treated differently than my own as a child, my time in France began raising questions about what I, as a racialized researcher, could study and why. I felt that the majority of my graduate student colleagues and my professors that I knew were also investigating languaging experiences and literacy practices of largely racialized populations were actually themselves white monolinguals. So where did their legitimacy come from? And where were all the brown applied linguists? I finished my PhD, and upon graduating, I moved to the United States to take up my first academic position as a tenure-track professor at a research-intensive university. Although I had always identified as being part of a multi-racial immigrant family, my move to the United States as a relatively young parent myself, now raising a multiracial, multicultural, multilingual child, prompted me to engage with my questions about my identities in a deeper way. I had thought that I had reached a level of relative comfort in my own skin, but now I was navigating a new country, school system, culture, and context with my child. While my graduate training had helped me hone critical skills for theorizing and analyzing teaching and learning in multilingual contexts, being a mother during my PhD relocated theory and practice from my mind into my body. I not only had skin in the game in a new way, but I also had my very heart. And it was tied up in raising my son and supporting his education as a racialized alien parent in the political, cultural, and linguistic context of the US. While I recognized that I was in some ways reliving my parents' story in a new country, I did so with tremendous privilege, the privilege of education, language, and relative work security. My very first week on campus, however, as a newly hired professor, I was invited to join a support group for junior faculty of color who would be meeting throughout the year to read and discuss Carrie Rockamore's book, A Black Academic's Guide to Winning Tenure Without Losing Your Soul. It immediately caused a reaction in me to say, why do I need a support group? What am I recovering from? And I was at the time unfamiliar with Rockamore's work and her leadership with the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity, which I now highly recommend. The invitation, though, took me by surprise because I didn't understand Black as an inclusive category, and I assumed that I wouldn't necessarily be welcomed or find a sense of belonging as a brown Canadian amongst a group of Black American academics. While I longed to find a place within an institution that I hoped would be my professional home throughout my career, the lingering shadow of a personal sense of cultural liminality and linguistic illegitimacy haunted my professional becoming. I had wrestled through so much of my own life with dwelling at the margins of being a multiracial Indian, Japanese, Canadian. Never being Indian enough, never being Japanese enough, because I didn't speak the languages, didn't practice the religions, didn't look the same color as either Indian or Japanese family members or communities. And I had internalized the belief that my parents held that education was the key to securing their success and my own. I had believed that finishing my PhD and moving into a tenure-track position would mean that I had finally met the criteria for belonging, and at least within an academic context. While I had obtained the academic credential of a PhD and been offered entry into the American Academy with a tenure-track position, neither the degree nor the position was a guarantee for acceptance, inclusion, or belonging. In retrospect, I do wonder at times if I had joined that support group, whether my experience might be different. I may have felt less isolated. But when I eventually did go forward to seek support for harassment, I was advised by the university administration that racism is systemic here, and it isn't going anywhere. Certainly not by the time you get tenure. So you should consider what's the premium you would need to be paid to continue working under these conditions. I was not unaware that racism is systemic, but I had hoped for more support. Another racialized colleague tried to assure me that my experiences in the US, in the academy, and beyond would sharpen my scholarship because it would make me more critical. And she was right. The research questions I ask today focus on making visible the ways in which power relations among languages and their users impact teaching and learning in multilingual contexts. While I work towards a theory of change to foster cultural and linguistic collaboration and to address students' racial-linguistic experiences of racial-linguistic discrimination and trauma, I still find it deeply unsettling that the premium I've had to pay to find my place in the academy has been paid with my life at my own expense. My abiding question remains then, how do I remain soft and tender when stretched across the loom with a warped system bent on hardening me. I've shared here 4 woven textiles and autoethnographic reflections from my own personal and professional experiences along my journey becoming a Brown applied linguist and classroom-based researcher, unraveling intersectional identities. In weaving the final textile, black, period, I used black sari silk yarn as the warp, and an article I published as a faculty member in the US. The choice to print the article in reverse, with the text in white and the background in black, reflects the pressure I felt to write white as a scholar working in a predominantly white American research-intensive university, in order to be seen, as my tenure committee described, as an American scholar by my white monolingual tenure committee. The black background for the woven text, the black background of text woven into the black sari silk warp evokes an overwhelming sense of darkness that colored my experience in the U.S. While I look at the 4 finished textiles together, what surfaces is the erasure of my vitality and sovereignty as a multiracial, multicultural scholar in black. The use of different colors and texturalities in brown, blanche, américain highlights the poetic porousness of weaving myself across different international contexts. Each woven textile has its own complex 3-dimensional textures and tones that invite viewers to lean in and to examine closely subtle and intricate details. By contrast, the intersections of the black sari silk yarns on the white on black text produce a 2-dimensional effect of lamination, such that the seams at times disappear, much like I felt myself disappearing into darkness as I wrestled with my identities and positionality. Racism and discrimination across intersectional categories is as much a part of the Canadian university landscape where I find myself today. Still, I continue to pursue ways of weaving belonging in the academy and in schools for multiracial and multicultural, multilingual scholars, teachers, students, and their families. In my research, I've been working in schools to investigate how we foster spaces of linguistic and cultural collaboration to transform social representations of multilingualism. To do so, we have been working on a number of multilingual interventions in schools. And in this slide, I share an activity that we did with students in 3rd grade with Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince. And we were comparing translations of Le Petit Prince through their book covers, as well as exploring the text. And you can see them here in a variety of languages. And this conversation unfolded with a group of 3 students, where one student says, "Is this Arabic or Hebrew? I'm confused." Student 2, "I know this one is Arabic because that is how you spell my dad's name." Student 1, "Okay, so this is Hebrew." And student 3, "I chose to use, in his own writing, Japanese because it looks cool and my karate teacher uses Japanese." So what begins to occur as we bring multilingual materials into classrooms is that it allows us to have conversations and normalize those conversations around languages and language users. And we see that students' connections to these languages are much more fluid than the categories of native-like proficiency or native speakerism. In another example, we have used the story Rosie's Walk. And this is, the students were making their own multilingual book covers after exploring a number of books. And we were in Spanish dual language, English-Spanish dual language program. And I had given the instructions in English, but students were allowed to respond however they wanted. And this was a grade 1 class. And so in the first example, the student has created a book cover in Hebrew. And she identifies that she uses Hebrew. And when asked why, she explains that it's my culture. This was the first time that the teacher recognized that this student came from a Jewish background. And even though she was a Latinx student, this part of her identity within this bilingual program had never surfaced. In the next example, we have an English speaker who has used Korean, written in Spanish, and explains that she knows a little bit of Korean. And this was after a number of weeks, and we had a Korean research assistant on our team who had read Rosie's walk in Korean to the class. And so this student identified that she now recognized a little bit of Korean and could include it in her communicative repertoire. And so in both of these cases, students were either sharing parts of themselves that they identified deeply with, or sharing parts that were beginning, signs of expanding their linguistic repertoires or communicative repertoires. And so those were very positive examples, but here is another incident that emerged across all grade 3 classrooms that we did an activity with Eric Carl's Very Hungry Caterpillar. We had the story that you might be familiar with, that goes through the days of the week, and we talked about the days of the week in a variety of languages. And we had the book covers. Some of them were bilingual versions, some of them were monolingual versions in 27 different languages. And we asked students in groups to create categories, to do a sorting exercise with these book covers to see what types of categories do they have that they will make explicit through sorting. And I'll just read you the transcript from the researcher, who's R, and the student, who's S1. How are you grouping your caterpillars? This is the book covers. We're grouping them into multilingual and monolingual. And then we're grouping multilingual ones into ones that use human letters, English letters, and those that don't. Oh, that's interesting. So tell me more about the ones you said use English letters. Well, these ones use human. English letters. Why do I keep saying that? Well, that's a good question. Why do you think you keep saying human instead of English? I don't know. Did you realize that people speak so many different languages? And the conversation continues. And when we first started talking about this as a research team, and even with the teacher, the reaction was, this is really troubling, that there is an association with humanity with English. And we thought, oh, this is an isolated incident in this case. It was a small group discussion. But it recurred in every single grade 3 class we worked with, and we did 5. And it was brought to a whole class discussion about what does it mean to be a human language. And one of the things that came out of this discussion was that we are very prepared to call out discrimination based on race now, or based on gender, or based on other social categories, but there seems to be something privileged about language, that it's okay not to talk to someone if you don't speak their language. We are excused from the work of inclusion when we aren't proficient. And this conversation that first emerged as being very unsettling became, I was going to say a trampoline. I was thinking in French. A trampoline for starting new conversations about why are the categories that or the social representations, the images we have or that we associate with languages so important to articulate and to externalize so that we can begin to talk about them. And so from this, I started working on the notion of becoming multilingual listeners. That even if a person identifies as a monolingual, dominant language speaker, they can become a multilingual listener who's prepared to lean into multilingual communication with empathy as well as with linguistic and cultural sensitivity. And in a paper that is in press right now, I've said that in diverse contexts where teachers are increasingly called upon to support multilingual learners from multiple different cultural and linguistic backgrounds in mainstream classrooms, we've used this concept of becoming multilingual listeners as a way of making multilingualism accessible. It's hard for monolinguals to identify as being able to become multilingual, but the multilingual listener can take an active stance as an English-dominant speaker who recognizes their linguistic privilege and takes responsibility for mediating communication with multilingual speakers based on an understanding of multilingualism as natural, flexible, and fluid, and creative, and their critical awareness of the relations of power that perpetuate systemic barriers for minoritized multilingual speakers in schools and society. So we build on this with the notion of multilingual allyship. And allyship is an active and sustained, arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a minoritized group. And the 5 types of action that we've documented in classrooms to demonstrate multilingual allyship include disrupting monolingualism as the norm, recognizing linguistic privilege, engaging in multilingual risk-taking, and entering into linguistic and cultural collaboration with people and communities beyond our communicative comfort, and becoming a language activist. Shohami has talked about it's not enough just to become aware, that awareness needs to lead to activism. And so we've done that in schools, now in the US and in Canada, through multilingual project-based learning, where we design projects that intentionally have students from different linguistic backgrounds work together. Here is an example of using multilingual mentor texts. This is again Eric Carl, who has a book called Brown Bear, What Do You See?, that we adapted into a science unit, and students wrote about animal habitats. And you can see here there was some pre-planning in English and Spanish, but then the books were also translated with the help of parents and community members into Korean and French, and it depended on the languages that were represented in the classroom. Here's another example where students were working on similes in grade 3 language arts, and a family member came in to support translating into Arabic, and students practiced writing in Arabic and understanding different conventions of print. And this is an example from a grade 1 science unit about the life cycle of plants. And so here we are looking at reinforcing content learning multilingually, which then becomes a resource for future students who also share those linguistic backgrounds. And a key component of this work has also now been focusing on how do we start to begin to acknowledge the language ecologies of the spaces in which we work, bringing in Indigenous languages as well as local languages and heritage languages. And so in this case we had Yucatec Maya, which is an Indigenous language in Mexico that was spoken by one of the families, and we compared the names of the animals across languages and realized that there were sometimes not words in Yucatec Maya for specific animals because those animals didn't exist in those contexts. So I'm trying to think of an example, but polar bear, for example, there aren't polar bears in Mexico, and so there was no word that we could provide for the Yucatec Maya, so we borrowed the Spanish. But by bringing languages into the classroom, we not only were able to leverage the linguistic expertise of the community, but also to have discussions, even at a young age, of the ways in which language carries meaning, carries culture, carries structure. And students were very proud, particularly at these young ages, of sharing these parts, these hidden talents with their classes. So I'm going to stop with one last story, and this was part of our process, that we had community members help us, and so we took the time to write thank you notes, some authentic writing and risk-taking. And in this case, one of the students, who was an Anglophone, decided he wanted to try and write thank you in Arabic. And there was a student in the class whose family had helped, and so he wrote the shukran in Arabic on the boards for the student to copy. And this student, I took a picture of the message he had written the first time, and he brought it to me and to the Arabic speaker and said, "Look what I did. I wrote a thank you note for your family." And I initially looked at it and I was like, okay. And the student, his friend, was like, "What did you do?" And if you look closely, you will notice that he's written the entire message in reverse. It says, "Dear Karim's family, thank you, shukran, for being so kind and helping us make this book in different languages." he had learned in our exploration of stories that Arabic is written in the opposite direction that we read English in. And so when his friend had told him to write the message, he said, well, I thought that you would read English that way too. And I was like, that's actually a hard thing to do. And it took me a moment. But when you realize that he's made a very sophisticated guess about how to interpret or how to translate. And so it's given us pause to say, how do children make sense of different languaging and literacy practices? And what we consistently see is that it's possible for monolingual Anglophone students to take risks and try these things out, and then to mediate them in community. And so this gave the Arabic-speaking student a chance to show and model for this other student how to write the message and to rewrite the message as a thank you note, to recognize that saying thank you in your language is a powerful thing. And so there are, I could go on with stories about both discrimination as well as moments of hopeful change. But I think this gives you a little bit of a taste of the types of work that I'm doing to try and foster a sense of belonging, of multilingual belonging, and within school spaces. So I drew on a whole bunch of different pieces that are coming out right now, so I just put them up there. So that you can take a look, and I'm happy to take questions or feedback or comments.
First of all, thank you for coming and presenting. I have two quick questions, if that's okay. First, the book. Was there a certain process or kind of criteria for picking the scholars that wrote in the book, or was it kind of just, and are they Toronto-based?
No, that's an excellent question. So the book has a life history of its own, and it started by with Natalie Auger and I when I was in France, and what we realized was we were talking about experiences of linguistic diversity in schools with very different reference points because of our linguistic backgrounds. And sometimes in translation, it felt like we were in conflict. But because we had a whole year together, we were able to work through those conflicts and realize that we actually had a lot more in common than what was different. And we said, well, then how much more am I missing out on when I only read someone's paper and I don't know who they are, and I don't know what the context is that they're writing out of? And so we started, because I was in Canada at the time, looking at comparing Canadian and French scholars who write in English and French. And when we went to the editor, they were like, well, you have to think a bit more expansively than just English and French and just Canada and France. And so at that point, I had moved to the US, and we started looking more broadly to bring in more diversity and representation. And I think the other feedback that came in was that they said, you're not including enough racialized perspectives. And I was like, well, I don't know that you know who I am either. But so we were trying to represent a broad range of perspectives. We do have at least half of the authors who generally publish in French or in a language other than English. And so because of the linguistic repertoires of the editors, we accepted chapters initially in French and English. So if you could write in one of those languages, we were happy to have your contribution. And the book asks for your language biography, and then how you operationalize the concepts of multilingualism, plurilingualism, translanguaging, repertoire, and now I think there might be one more. And so you get a sense of how people are using these across different contexts. There was another question?
Yeah, if that's okay. So the emergence and kind of rapid development of like the internet and everything, has that been a net positive or net negative for
That's a big question. I'm going to give you a limited answer. I think that while a lot that's on the internet is in English, is published in English, it has also given, I think, teachers the opportunity to leverage multilingual resources that are available online in the classroom. And I know I was working with teachers through a research practice partnership in the US, and one of the teachers that was principally involved often said, you know, if I don't know something, I will Google it, and then my students confirm whether or not it's right. And so I think that what it is doing is making it possible to build on the expertise that's in the room. I don't know. I think that it also tends that people feel like, oh, you're going to have your work more seen if it's in English, and so there's a tendency towards publishing in English too. So it's a both and. I think it depends on how you use it.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. So maybe I could share a little bit of my story.
Sure.
As a Korean language instructor, I've been teaching about almost 10 years at Seoul University. So what I found from my language classes was oftentimes it's those monolingual English speakers who are minoritized.
Okay. Yeah.
Speakers, especially those from the cultural linguistic backgrounds that are similar to the Korean language and culture. And that's more evident while they are going up to higher levels.
Right.
So it's not only this pervasive ideology at the highest level that influences our learners, it's also at their social pockets, classrooms, communities that could be in conflict with other ideologies. So that was just my little sharing.
Yeah.
So it's a little different perspective into how we look at monolingual English.
Right. I think it's so important that we are paying attention to the various tensions that emerge. And I think that's where intersectionality has really helped by thinking about not looking at one category exclusively and looking at the heterogeneity within a concept. Yeah, I think the privilege of homogeneity no longer holds. I think that one of the things that I first found difficult about intersectionality is that it merges out of, being talked about in legal studies with a car accident, and it felt very violent to me. And so weaving for me brought together intersections, but with the intention of making something whole. And my concern in schools and in learning is that learning is generally involves risk-taking and is a courageous process. And so we need students to feel safe in doing so. And so moving towards something that is promoting wholeness rather than violence, that we want them to bring their whole selves, is why I've landed in weaving communicative repertoires. Yes.
And you mentioned previously that you were with friends for French, which is why I wanted to ask you very recently there was a from either Algeria, Arabic or Turkish.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know, first of all, if you have encountered that phenomenon, and also what do you think of that as someone from multicultural, multilingual background?
Okay, so I think the question was about loan words from other languages and how they. Right. Yeah, I think that one of the reasons I became interested in the concept and theory of plurilingualism is that language variation is so much a part of that conceptualization. So it's not just that this capacity for everyone to be plurilingual stems from the fact that we speak with different registers and different varieties, even within the same language. And in terms of loanwords, I think that that's a natural process. That's a natural reflection of mobility in the world, that everything is moving and becomes taken up. That it shows, and I think that it is controversial for some people, that languages are being changed, but they are living things. And I've always thought, languages have lives because of their users. And so that's how it gets determined. But in a context like France, where there is what's the word? The academy that controls the language, that's very conflictual. I think, I have a PhD student who's now graduated and did her dissertation on the inclusion of language variety in teaching, particularly of French in higher education. And what she found is that people tend to not teach language varieties because of the way they are racialized, which really helps uncover the ratio-linguistic ideologies that are embedded in the ways in which we teach language. And so she's really been pushing for how do we begin to incorporate language varieties, and for the purpose of when you travel to France, which is often the goal of learning a world language, to speak with speakers in that context, a lot of students find they can't communicate or they can't understand because they've learned a variety of French in the classroom that doesn't correspond with the lived experience of that language in context. And so we do have to think about what's the goal of my life, and how does that also help me meet institutional goals in terms of assessment. Is it possible to do both and? I hope so. And I think so. I think that as we raise language awareness and linguistic and cultural sensitivity, there can be more awareness of how academic language in the institution functions, as well as the richness and vitality that comes from these loanwords and these experiences. Yes?
A lot of powerful messages intersectionality, the fact that some languages have skin colors, right? We can think about whiteness or in-tone from past.
Can you speak louder, please?
Okay, I'll try.
Thank you.
So the question, I love your metaphor about weaving, but as I was listening to you, I'm thinking about what is the agency? Who's doing the weaving? And is that weaving in response to something? So this process of weaving as well as the agency. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the work that I've been doing a lot of reading about weaving now because it became such a powerful metaphor for me. And I think Paulus's work around wefting the warp has been helpful because I think about, when I was learning to weave, it was about taking the weft and going through the warp, and the warp was fixed. And in her work, she's turning it on its upside down and saying, well, no, actually, you need both and if you only have the warp, you don't have a textile. And so I do recognize, I think that we have agency in how we do the act of weaving, but nothing is formed unless you engage in the process, right? You don't have a textile, you just have you either have the warp or you have the weft. And so for me, I am bound by an institution, as a professor. To get tenure, I'm bound by the tenure policies, or in the classroom as a teacher, I'm bound by the curriculum or the language policies, or as a parent, I set the language policies. But my child will still, resist, or you often hear of that type of thing. And so I have power in terms of how the weft is going through and what composes that weft. And I think that as you keep weaving, the two come together. And so hopefully that warp is being changed in the process. It's making something new. And in the written piece that this comes from, I talk about warped institutions, building on the idea that they do form the warp, but in many cases are warped. And I think that could be transformed into something more positive, that we could see institutions change. But we're not going to see that change until there's enough, of a difference of texture and textuality within them. Yes?
I was having the observation with the elementary schoolers categorizing like other languages that they're not familiar with as like non-human versus like English being really, really interesting. Do you know if any research has been done or is being done to see if that same phenomenon happening in like countries where children are brought up speaking like multiple languages at once?
I think that would be fascinating to study. If someone wants to give me a grant to go somewhere, I would be happy to do that. But I don't know. I honestly don't know if someone's looking at that in another context. I think that what I'm hearing over and again in doing these types of experiences is this division between things that we recognize as language or languages and things that aren't. And so often I have heard students refer to languages that don't follow an alphabetic system as being scribbles or being, undecipherable. And I've had a lot of reaction from teachers when these things surface of like, oh my gosh, this is really problematic. And I'm like, but we don't want to actually shut those conversations down. This is an opportunity to have the conversation about why do we have that reaction. And I think another thing that often emerges is laughter. And even in the bilingual dual immersion schools that I was working in, teachers would say when we introduced languages other than the languages of instruction and students would laugh, they would be like, they can't laugh, like that's not okay. And I was like, well, it is that nervousness that's beginning to surface that is part of being an embodied language user listener. And so rather than, simply disciplining it, maybe we need to talk about where it comes from, why it's emerging, and then what we do about it. And for me, that comes into multilingual listening. How do we help students begin to become comfortable navigating and building relationships in multilingual settings? No.
I have a maybe related anecdote to share. I had an encounter experience where I was engaged with someone and who said he thinks of the world as having two languages, his language and English, right? So there are other speakers of other languages and he would say, how many Englishes do you speak? How many Englishes do you speak? So any language that's different from mine is a kind of English.
Interesting.
I mean, this is a real person.
Yeah.
A real encounter, right? So
A kid or a grown-up?
a grown-up.
Wow.
Yeah, a grown-up person will ask, how many Englishes do you speak? Yeah, instead of how many languages do you speak? Right? Because the one I speak is a language. The one that what you everybody else, if you don't speak my language,
You speak English. Yeah. Wow.
What was the comparable language? What was the language?
This person speaks a dialect of Chinese.
Okay.
Yeah, not languages. Yeah, a dialect. Apparently,
Yeah.
it has something to do with about the education, the people that he's met, and so on, life experiences. But this is a particular linguistic world, right?
Yeah, and I think I grew up surrounded by a lot of languages, so I was very sensitive to it, and I think I was destined to become an applied linguist. But when I started this work, particularly in the U.S., and I was working with kindergarten students, we started hearing from parents who said, before in their interviews and surveys, they were saying, I don't think my child knew there were other languages than English and Spanish. And I was just surprised that was a common reality. And so then the reactions that students have to these types of activities are curiosity, but also nervousness. And so trying to figure out how do we build mediational competence for all speakers rather than just for the bilinguals and multilinguals. And then how does doing that support multilingual learners in the classroom, because we're making explicit processes that they use legitimately to mediate their learning. Oh. Yes.
Thank you so much for this talk. Very touching. And we felt like you talked about not only oral language but also lots of written languages, scripts. And I was impressed that some young children are using them as cloud, like a symbol of their culture.
Yes.
And on the other hand, as you said, there's a fear, when they see something different scripts, they fear. So it's really double sword edge languages are.
Yes.
But the problem is the fear.
Right.
And how to break it is really has to be through language, linguistic elements, words,
Yes.
sentences, and characters. And I think in this context, I think it's really important to offer foreign languages, and I shouldn't say foreign languages, but I should say additional languages, and not only major languages, but also variety of languages.
Yes.
But right now, language education is declining, which is very scary for us. And do you have some suggestions, general suggestions, directions that we should take for this?
I wish I had an answer. I do see the decline in world language education to be a really grave concern, and I think the removal of diversity is something that's a concern. And while I don't think that language awareness is a panacea for everything, I do think that building critical multilingual language awareness from a young age has the potential to change how prepared students are to take foreign languages. And one of the reasons I think that critical language awareness, for all teachers is necessary is that it's something that we can all do. And so I'm doing a study right now called Awareness Matters, researching teachers' preparedness to teach for critical multilingual language awareness. And this is largely among both mainstream classroom teachers as well as language teachers. And my sense is that we often, at least in the Canadian context now, and I know this was true when I was working in the US as well, and when I was in France, that there is often a shortage of teachers to teach world languages. And so to suggest that we need to increase world language offerings when we don't have teachers in the pipeline is challenging too. And so if we take a language awareness approach, it actually is possible for all of us to develop language awareness. It's probably essential as a knowledge base for teachers, even working in monolingual contexts. But that's a whole nother argument to make. And so I often ask, what does it take to engage teachers in becoming aware of their own linguistic biases, but also of their own degree of language awareness, and then how do we develop it? And so my taglines are usually awareness matters and growth is required. So that thinking about multilingual listening is something that's more accessible than becoming multilingual is my stepping stone to get there. Yes?
Do you think that, like you were saying about the language, education declining and awareness, do you think that has anything to do with the emergence of more accessible access to like Google Translate and other like online programs that can translate at the tip of your fingertip? And do you think that has any?
Yeah, you know, there's lots of talk right now about ChatGPT, and I know that translation tools have been around for a long time, and have become very sophisticated. And you know, I often use Antidote in French and other tools to help me. I think that it's important for us to recognize that these tools are here, and how do we use them to amplify our teaching rather than ignore them as though they don't exist. Whether or not that impacts whether people are inclined to take world languages, I really don't know. I think that there might be a feeling that you don't have to invest as much in order to be able to communicate. I don't have an answer there. I would hope that instead people would have the encounter of like, oh, this is really fascinating, and go further. But I know that that might not always be the case. Yes?
If I could just follow up on that question, I think that this availability of technological resources is going to change fundamentally the way we think. Right? We have always thought that we must learn French in order to communicate. If we meet someone who speaks French. Now it's less of a tool-based kind of orientation, because you have the tool, you have your cell phone, you use Google Translate.
Right.
So now learning languages is about expanding your repertoire, expanding your thinking repertoire, your thought processes, your identity options. I think it's going to change the way we think about why we care, right? I think it's going to be less utilitarian-based, less tool-based, and less instrumental, thinking of language as instruments, but rather as a resource for exploration, for making connections, transformation, for self-transformation.
Wouldn't that be nice? That's hopeful. Maybe a good place to stop, unless there's another question.
Well, maybe I could ask you to say a word or two before you finish, when you were talking about critical language awareness for teachers. I think the teachers you were referring to were largely K-12 ones, but I hope I know we can agree that that's equally important at this level.
At the post-secondary level.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to say.
Sure. I think, I've taught a graduate seminar on critical multilingual language awareness. I think I tend to teach in this way in general when I'm teaching, because I recognize that we have students in our classrooms that come from a variety of linguistic backgrounds with a variety of communicative repertoires. And so I apply those same principles in the classroom, that we need to center multilingualism and recognize that knowledge is encoded in a variety of languages. And so I think how we set up language policies in our classroom matter. So this semester, for example, we were talking about the fact that I have a number of francophones in my class, and because I am open to having students speak in other languages, they do intervene in class in French, and that might mean that some students don't understand, but it gives us an opportunity to then, in real time, figure out how do we build understanding in this context. And I think that one of the challenges is that we have been socialized to believe that when we don't speak the language, we don't have to participate, that we have to unlearn that. And in order to get somewhere, we have to let students experience it in a safer space. And so that's one of the strategies that I've been using to say, what are the power relations that are at work here? Who feels more confident and capable of intervening in discussion? And how do we normalize using other languages in this space and providing the bridges? And I think, it's not just about the languages we use, but the cultural practices of, discussion-based seminars, that in some cultures people don't interrupt. There's a longer wait time, or there is a tendency not to speak out until it's your turn. And so being able to make those things explicit, for me, a lot of critical language awareness work is about making the implicit explicit so that we can name it and we can then do something with it. But when it rests internal or implicit, then the onus rests only with the individual learner, and often the burden remains with them. And I say that in the context of K-12, that burden is too great. They have enough to do as students engaged in learning that we should be able to help lift that burden. And the same applies in graduate school. Okay. Well, thank you.